what I want to do is to try and think about writing very much as this idea of writing as design, where what you're trying to do is induct children into what it means to be a designer or a crafter of writing. And to do that, what we're trying to do is enhance and strengthen students' ability to make decisions themselves about the choices that they're making in their writing. And we've got a pedagogy, we call it the extra pedagogy, but that's just because of where we're from, with specific pedagogical principles for this. One of the things that does is it creates a real strong explicitness about language choices, and that's one of the things I'm going to be talking you through today. It's also focusing on very much how do we create classrooms where children can be in a community of writers. And I'm going to be looking at two very specific strands through this session to explore with you. One of them relates to the writing process. That's why I'm going to get you writing. I want to do something with you alongside the explicit choices. That's to try and show that the way we think about writing needs to be holistic. Our research has focused quite heavily on the grammar side of things, but that doesn't mean that we think that the only way you can teach writing is through the grammar. It's got to be part of this bigger picture. And the other strand of our writing has looked a lot at how children manage the writing process and how we can help that. So I'm going to be looking at those two things with you in particular. Coming back to that notion of the craft of writing, there's a children's author in England called Nicola Davis. She's actually a zoologist, and so she writes books for children that are either animal non-fiction texts around the science of it, or she writes fictional stories for young children. But she says that one of the things that she's realised as a writer is, in effect, that writing is like a craft, and that as a professional writer, she understands that craft of writing, and she compares writing to the skill of shaping a bowl out of pottery or making appropriate dovetail joints in carpentry. And she also says that it was the experience of really looking at other people's writing and realising that she could look at other people's writing and see how it could be fixed that made her realise she had these skills. And what we're really interested in is how do we help young writers, apprentice writers to that craft of writing, understand what those skills are, and particularly skills that go beyond what you might call the surface features of writing. So it's not just the spelling and the punctuation, but it is that shaping and crafting of meaning. And then there's another quote from somebody that I'm pretty confident no one will have heard of. We've been working with a charitable organisation in England called Arvon, which is a creative writing foundation, so we've had several joint projects. And they've been running for 50 years, and what they do is they have professional writers like Nicola Davis, working with people who want to be writers, giving them guidance on being writers, but they also run residentials for school children, helping them to write, and for teachers as writers. And it's the teachers as writers bit that we've been most involved in. And Fairfax and Moat started this charity, and one of the things they said was this notion of the craft, but also that every craft has its rudiments that must be taught. I think that's what we're interested in. How can we help young writers to understand what those rudiments are? And then coming again to another writer, children's writing, we've drawn a lot in our work on what professional writers have said about their experiences of being writers. Tim Bowler talks a lot about the way in which when you're writing, you can have a real tension between the creative and the critical, and that the one can get in the way of the other and not be constructive. And he argues very much that we need to be much better at giving the imagination free rein, not letting our judgment come in and say it's rubbish before we even got anything out on the page. But then we also have to bring in the critical hammer afterwards, because that also links to that notion of the writing process. And at what stage does evaluation and reviewing and revision happen, and when is it appropriate for it to happen? Thinking about international research on writing and what does it tell us, it's actually a much younger field than the research on reading. We know a lot more about teaching of reading, but 4 things that tend to come through internationally are these 4 areas. One is that notion of the writing process, which I said I'm going to home in on a bit today. First of all, that's about how you help children to understand that the writing process involves, and there are different names for the different parts, but in a nutshell, some form of planning, drafting and reviewing, and that it's recursive, not linear. So one of the things we work on quite a lot is how, in a classroom setting where time and lesson blocks and whatever tends towards linearity, how can you make the writing process much more recursive, a messier process, which is what professional writers explain it to be. And then also, how do you enable students and young writers to be good at self-regulating, understanding for themselves as learners how they manage the writing process. Just for example, if you hate revising, what strategies might you develop in order to help you to revise more constructively? Then the written text itself, so the writing process is really about the writer and how the writer manages things. The written text is all about the text itself. And here the evidence is very much around that explicitness, the explicit teaching of writing, which unpacks or demystifies for young writers the how of composing a text. And alongside that are strategies that are really familiar, I think, in most writing classrooms, like using text as models and teachers modelling their own writing choices. Then there's the notion of the context, that writing actually occurs in a context. Interestingly, if you think about a lot of activities we do in education, there's probably an international sense of what it is to get better at it. Writing's an exception to that, because the idea of what good writing is not a fixed value, it's a culturally determined thing. And so I go from country to country, and there can be really big differences between what children are being taught in one country about what good writing is compared to what they're being taught in another country. And you may even notice it when you get governmental changes, we certainly do in England, that, you know, what good writing is changes because the government's got a different view. But we're also particularly interested in the classroom context of writing, and how as teachers and leaders of teachers we can create a classroom community that allows writers to thrive and for them to have a real sense of authorship and ownership of the process. And then finally, this idea of playfulness, which I think links quite a lot to what Doug Fisher was talking about in terms of the struggle. I think sometimes the reason why children don't want to engage with learning moments where they have to struggle is because they worry about failing. But actually the whole point of struggling is to learn through the process, and we don't always succeed when we're trying to do something, but the process of trying is what's important and what you learn from it. And certainly in terms of writing, we don't ever get to the point, any of us, where we can be absolutely confident that the piece of writing we're about to do is going to be brilliant. Writing is not quite like that. It's one of those things where sometimes you can have a go at writing something and it's not as good as previous efforts at writing are. And the professional writers will often talk about editors who say, yeah, well, this is fine, but if you scrap the first 50,000 words of this story and start there, it might be okay. And I think alongside that playfulness is creating that sense of a safe space where actually trying something out and not getting it quite right is valued as part of learning about writing, rather than being seen as a problem because you didn't do it well. And so we draw on all of that in the work that we've been doing. Pulling together what I'm really going to focus on is this idea of writing as a craft, the idea where in order to craft and shape a text, where you're really thinking about meaning, you've got to bring together that attention to the writing process and explicit teaching, and that you need to do that within a context where you're creating a rich and responsive community of writers that values authorship and values playfulness and experimentation as part of that learning process. And so the effective teaching, we looked at our research, the characteristics of effective teaching would be these kinds of things. How do you support young writers in making choices and gaining that kind of independent control of their writing, rather than a dependency on what someone else says they need to do to make it good? How do you create classrooms where you can acknowledge the recursiveness and the messiness of the writing process? How do you create classrooms that really build on that interrelationship between reading and writing? And that all of this is really moving towards how do we help apprentice writers to become more and more confident about the choices that they make, so that they're independent in their writing and more confident about being an author rather than simply a schooled writer. I don't know if you know these images. They're the Harrisburg images, and they're American, and they're all freely available on the internet, but I know an awful lot of places where they've used them as starting points for creative writing, and each of them is like this. There's an image that in some ways is a little bit mysterious, or in some of them very surreal. This one isn't quite so surreal. And in each one there's a caption, and the caption itself is a sort of tease or problem that links to the picture. Now what I'm going to get you to do is to do some free writing. So in other words, I want you to allow the creative bit to work. I don't want you thinking of the critical. No one's going to read this, no one's going to assess it, but this is just a starting point for some writing. And by free writing, I mean you're just going to write non-stop for 2 minutes, and I want you to keep writing. So even if you can't think what to write, you're right, I can't think what to write. But I want you to look at the image and think about where might that take you? What's happening in this story? It could be even who's drawn the picture, what's the bright light, anything about that image. What about that tiny voice? Is he the one? What might he be the one for? So in other words, I just want you to free write non-stop for 2 minutes. And we often say when we're talking to children about this, is just write, let your pen take your imagination for a walk. It might be your fingers if you're using a laptop. So okay, 2 minutes, off you go. Now hang on to that, because we're going to come back to it at various points through the session, so we will return to it. So what I want to do now is just whiz through a few slides that really look at this notion of the relationship between reading and writing. We're very interested in the reader, in the writer. I think if we were looking at reading comprehension, we'd be very interested in the writer and the reader. So in other words, when you're writing, it's really helpful to think about how to be the reader of your writing. But when you're reading, it's also very helpful to think about the person who wrote the text. So there's a real symbiotic relationship. And I have 2 quotes from 2 American writers about research. The first one focuses on writing, and the second one focuses on reading. But actually, in some ways, they're saying some very similar things. And there are some things I'd like to just draw out. One, this idea of children must read like writers. How do we enable that kind of reading? How do they see themselves as writers? That links very much to that idea of how do you create a community in the classroom where they see themselves as writers? And also, how do they see texts as things that they have the possibility to produce? They're not things that are beyond their ability. Other people do. They're things that they could produce. The active reader is reading what the writer is doing, so looking at what the writer's doing. The active reader understands the writer's purpose and also the techniques that realise that purpose. So what you've got there is a sense of how symbiotic that relationship is between reading and writing, but also it's drawing out very much that idea of, in terms of writer's purpose, the idea of authorial intention. What do you want to do with this piece of writing? And that notion of techniques is very much about, well, what's the craft? What craft skills can you bring to bear on this piece of writing? So I'd like you now to go back to that little piece of writing that you were just looking at. 2 minutes is a really short time for free writing. When we worked with teachers on a Teachers as Writers project, the professional writers were giving them 20-minute bursts. When they were doing it in their classrooms with children, young children, they were doing 10 to 15 minutes. So you've only got a short amount, but what I'd like you to do is just look back at what you have written so far and see in what you've already got, whether there's a seed of a narrative, a seed of an idea, whether there's characters already beginning to emerge, are there settings emerging, or even if rereading it triggers thoughts of characters or stories or settings that you haven't written down, so you can go beyond what you've written. But just go through it and then annotate anything you think's interesting or underline it, or write some more. So again, I'm just going to give you 2 minutes for that. Okay, so if you stop that, and again, hold it, because we'll come back to that in a moment. So just in those two little writing activities, you've done one where you're letting the creative imagination play. It's playful. You were focusing on getting ideas out and down, not on evaluating them. In this activity, you're beginning to use some of your reviewing skills. You're rereading what you've written and you're making some judgments. So just in those two activities, you've got the writing process being played out once where you're looking at how you generate the ideas, but at this stage, you're still looking at the generating, but you're also evaluating. So you've got that recursiveness coming through, and I'll be doing that all the way through. You'll see other things happening there. So let's just look now at this idea of choice. This is coming more to the explicitness of the language and being more explicit about what children might do in terms of language choices. I want to give you a little bit of a discussion task. So this is one sentence from a book by Michael Morpurgo, former children's laureate in England, who wrote War Horse. And this is a book about Arthurian legend, Arthur, High King of Britain. We've used it in primary schools, upper primary, to do a unit of work in which a lot of these approaches are exemplified. Now, this sentence is a really key moment in the plot. I don't know how hot you are on Arthurian legend, but when Arthur gets the sword, Excalibur, the sword comes out of the lake and is given to him. And this is the moment just before it's the lady in the lake who comes out of the water with the sword. And it's that point. So it's a key moment in the plot. So what I'd like you to do, in pairs or threes, depending on where you're sitting, is read the sentence aloud. I think one of the things we encourage a lot is letting children hear text aloud, not just text by other authors, but also their own, because it's one of the ways you can help children hear the rhythm of the text and what it sounds like, but also how you can put yourself in the position of being a reader of your own writing in a way. So read it aloud and think about where will you put the emphasis. Can you think about different ways to reorder that sentence? So you can't take anything out or put anything in, but you can move the chunks of the sentence around or words in the sentence. And if you move things around, how does that alter the emphasis? Okay, so just a minute or so, just talking about that, reading it aloud and then discussing where the emphasis lies. So now you've got another sentence. It's one possible version of that reordering. One of the things about that particular sentence is there's quite a lot of possibilities for how you could move things around, but this is just one possibility. And what I'd like you to do now is to read both the sentences aloud so you hear them both together, and then discuss how do they portray that point in the plot differently. And you might want to think about if you're being commissioned to film this and you've only got those two sentences, how would you film this moment in the plot, and how would it be different in the second one compared with the first one? And then move that discussion on a bit to look particularly at some of the things that have changed here. You might look at, so what is the effect then of moving the adverbial out of the midst from the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence? And then the other thing you might look at is there's a subject-verb inversion going on in the first one. What's the effect of putting the subject, the figure in flowing green, after the verb in the first sentence, whereas in the second sentence it's before the verb, which of course is the normal place in English. It typically comes before the verb. So just have that little conversation then about those two sentences, the different portrayal of the plot moment and the effect of moving things around. Obviously, there are different ways that you might interpret the different portrayals, and I think that's important because this isn't about a black and white view of things, it's about an interpretation. But in general, most people tend to say that in the first one, the thing that's most important is the mists, and the figure is gradually revealed. And if you're filming it, it'd be lots of mists, perhaps, and the figure would sort of appear out of the mist. It might be a close-up becoming it might be a wide-angled shot becoming a close-up, homing on in the figure in flowing green. Whereas the second one, it's the figure that's foregrounded, and you see the figure first, and the mists are less important in the background. And that's a really good example of how something as straightforward, really, as making a choice about where you put information in a sentence alters how you're trying to make your reader see a particular moment in the plot. And the key thing is here that both of those sentences are equally good sentences. There's not a moral of this tale that says, if you want to do X, you should do Y. They're both good sentences. It depends as an author what you wanted to do at this moment. Are you going for mystery, eeriness, revelation, suspense? You go for the first one. If it's the figure that's really important and you want to really get into that, you go for the second one. So it's not about teaching children about good choices and bad choices. It's about teaching the repertoire of choices that are available to them. And actually it's syntax that's doing that. It's the movement of those adverbials that alters it, and then also the subject-verb inversion. Obviously, if you've got a subject-verb inversion, you have to wait to see what the subject of the verb is. So that's really useful for that sense of delay and suspense. Whereas in the first one, the subject comes first. So right from the moment, it's the figure, and then you later on find out what it's doing coming across the water. Another one, now I realised that you can actually read the answer on this one. On my version of the PowerPoint, it was blanked out. So I'll tell you what we're going to do and then move straight on to the next slide. This is the opening paragraph of a children's book that's read a lot, again, in England. And you're introduced to a character. And it's a wonderful way of introducing a character, because in the first paragraph, you know it's a him, so it's male, but that's all you know. But then you get this description of him, lying in there, in the darkness, behind the tea chests, in the dust and dirt. And what I'd like you to do is, again, just in pairs or threes, have a conversation about why do you think David Armand might have chosen those particular prepositional phrases, or the noun phrases that are in the prepositional phrases. It's debatable which is more important. And what do they suggest to you about this character? That if you're a reader, this is all the information you've got so far. It's a him. He was found in the garage on a Sunday afternoon, and he was lying in there, in the darkness, behind the tea chests, in the dust and dirt. What are you beginning to infer or speculate about this character? Okay, so just have that conversation. Now, again, I want to stress there's always interpretation involved with this, because I'm asking you as a reader what this language choice is doing for you. And the one thing you can't do as a writer, you can try, but you can't be certain how a reader will receive what you're doing. But usually, again, with this one, there's two different strands of interpretation that tend to come up. One is that this character is abandoned, rejected, unloved, disposed of, thrown away, because he's, you know, he's in the dust and the dirt, he's forgotten. Or that he's hiding, that he's alive, he might be malicious, he might not be, he might be evil, he might not be. But there's a real sense of, you know, why is he there in the darkness and what's he doing there? Does that fit with some of the things that you were thinking? Yeah, so that choice of description has created two different sort of ways of possibly thinking about this character that you would find more about if you read the story. Now, what if, instead of those choices, David Armand had made these choices, and all I've done really is alter those prepositional phrases and the noun phrases in them. So again, very quickly, just about 30 seconds, what changes if you change those prepositional phrases? What does this make you infer about the character compared to what the other ones made you infer about the character? Okay, so 30 seconds having that conversation. So something as simple as those changes alter how we see things. One of the real trends in our primary schools at the moment is children are taught to use wow words, which means to improve their vocabulary, or to use better words, and to use adjectives for describing. What this does, particularly because it isn't always followed through with that sense of why, what's it doing, is you get children thinking that they need to go through their text and change an adjective into an even better adjective. Now, the key thing is you can't choose a better adjective unless you know what it was you were trying to convey to your reader. Otherwise, all you're doing is choosing a vocabulary word that you think you might get a higher mark for. So if it's green, an adjective green grass, calling it jade grass or emerald grass is not necessarily any better than calling it green grass. fact, you might ask why you'd put green in at all. It'd be more interesting if it's brown grass, because grass is usually green. And what this is doing is really trying to highlight that choices you make have consequences. That actually the choice isn't an arbitrary one about putting something in or about choosing a better version. It's about doing it because of something that you want it to achieve in the writing. And with children, we find that these kinds of strategies where they see two versions of something are often a really useful way to highlight it. And again, we're not showing a bad example and a good example, both with the sentence and here with the prepositional phrases. Both are equally viable. It depends, in this case, where David Armand was going to take this story. So I'm going to want you to go back to your writing again, and what you've written, and have a look at it. And last time I said to look, what seeds are there? Can you annotate things? This time I want you to think particularly about character. Have you already got some seeds of characters in what you've written? Is there a key character that's already emerging that you feel quite interested in? Or if not, just rereading it, is there a new character that you'd like to include in a story that might be prompted by this picture? And I want you now to do free writing, but only about a character. Okay, and this is really just getting you to explore a little bit about a character who you could pursue in a story. So I'm only going to give you 2 minutes. Okay, so in order to really get into a little bit of depth about some of those explicit choices in language, I've decided just to focus on creating character in narrative. There's loads of things I could have done, including about non-fiction texts, but I just thought it might be helpful if I just focused on narrative and characterization, partly because we know that it's something that children often struggle with, that how you develop a character in a narrative is a sign of a more sophisticated writer emerging. So the things I'm going to focus on, and they're not the only things that you might focus on with narrative, are things that have really come out of our work with the professional writers and what they've done with the teachers and what the professional writers have drawn attention to as some of the characteristics of narrative. The one I haven't got there that they've all talked about is dialogue, but I just didn't have time to do that one as well. So one of them is show, not tell, that idea of how in a good characterization you reveal the character rather than just telling the reader about the character. The use of really specific concrete detail in your descriptions that make them believable, rounded, individualized characters rather than generic characters. Strong visual descriptions so that your reader can actually see them in their mind's eye. Inner reflection, showing what your character thinks like, or was thinking about or feeling through your writing, and naming characters, the power of naming and how the names are part of the characterization. And I'm, again, focusing in on nouns and noun phrases just for working on one little chunk of things. I could have focused in on all sorts of other things as well, although with character, noun phrases are particularly powerful. I want to look at this idea of show, not tell, and inference. What you're really doing with show, not tell is you're making your reader infer. And the minute I'm using the word infer, I'm hoping you're seeing that reciprocality between the reading and the writing, that in some ways this approach is helping children's reading comprehension as well as their writing, because they're seeing how readers in the text they read, how writers in the text they read, make them infer. The couple of slides I've got next are actually taken from the unit of work we've got for upper primary, so they're expressed for children rather than for you as an audience. So, here you've got this description of Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood's house, where Dahl is just telling us what the house is like. It's quite precise information. It's simply informational, explaining what the house layout is like. You could have a bit of a discussion about the adverb quite, and whether that word quite is creating a slight edge to this, suggesting perhaps, quite a nice house. Are they just very ordinary people? But in general, it's just giving us information about the house. But if you look at the description of Matilda's dad, Mr. Wormwood, and this is the first thing we hear about Mr. Wormwood, he was a small, ratty-looking man whose front teeth stuck out underneath a thin, ratty moustache. So actually, it's a strong visual description, which we're going to be talking about in a little while. But actually, it's doing a lot more work than just helping you to picture what he looks like. It's actually making us well, it's helping us to see that he's not a nice guy. It's very hard to like a ratty-looking man. I won't say anything about teeth sticking out, because that sounds rude, or about moustaches. But what he's really trying to do is, by suggesting what he looks like, he's making us infer the character. And even that thing about ratty being also a word for being bad-tempered or irritable. There's a double play there. But in general, we don't think of rats as nice creatures. So comparing a man to a rat is rarely likely to be a nice character. And you have that speculation about, well, okay, if instead of that he'd called him a cuddly bear-like man, wouldn't we have had a different feeling about what Mr. Wormwood was like? He'd have had to change the name Mr. Wormwood. It comes back to the naming later. But if he'd been a cuddly bear-like man, we'd have inferred different things about the character. So the describing is doing work for you as a writer in terms of how you're shaping your reader's response to what you've written. So description isn't simply about putting it in because you're supposed to have description in stories. It's about what the description is doing, what's its purpose. This was for the children. One of the things we've discovered over a sequence of projects is that it's important not to underestimate how explicit you have to be in verbalising what the learning was. So in our first versions of this slide wasn't there. They just did the activity before. But it's terribly easy to get bogged down into things about learning about rats and bears and not really getting the point about it being show, not tell. So this makes the learning really, really explicit and clear. And one of the things that's come out of this, I don't know if show, not tell is something that's talked about a lot here, but it's really common in primary schools that children are asked to show, not tell. But our learning conversations with children show that they've got very little understanding of what it really means. So they know they've got to do it, but they don't really know how to do it. So this is trying to make it a little bit more visible. What does it mean to show, not tell? And obviously it isn't just noun phrases, that you can show, not tell a lot through verbs. The way the actions happen will tell you things about the character as well. I asked before I came for some examples of Australian books that children are reading at the moment. So I had some Australian examples as well. And this is from a book about refugee camps it's called Bone Sparrow by Zana Freylon. And it's really about a little boy who was born, a Rohingya Muslim who was born in a refugee camp, and his experiences. It's quite a raw book, actually. It's quite a difficult book. Not difficult in a reading sense, but difficult in an emotional sense. And the interesting thing for me, and I wonder whether you'd have read it differently, because you might have known more than me, I assumed that this refugee camp was in Bangladesh, because all the pictures that I'd seen of the Rohingya Muslims were refugee camps in Bangladesh, and all the descriptions in it seemed to me like Bangladesh. But apparently it's in Australia. It's an Australian refugee camp for Rohingya Muslims. And back to authorial intention, when you get to the end of the book, there's a little end note by the author about her intentions in writing this book. And actually sharing some of those things with children are also really useful, because they kind of get into that idea of that, you're writing for a purpose. And her purpose was clearly to draw attention to what's happening in these refugee camps. But if you look at this, I'd just like you in pairs to read this little extract. The character that you're meeting here is Beaver. It's the first time in the story we meet this character, so at this point you know as much, you don't have to have read the rest of the book to know anything about, to read this book. How does the author make you infer about what the character of Beaver is? So what does she show you but not tell you? So you have to, first of all, read it and think, well, is this guy a nice guy or a nasty guy? Wise guy, silly guy, whatever. And then think, well, what's making me think that? And then have a conversation about that, okay? So I'm sure everybody has inferred that he's not a nice guy and that he's frightening. And I think if you'll probably come up with some of these things as some of the things that have done that. And a lot of this is about the noun phrases. I think the other thing that makes your reader infer is the boy's response to seeing him. So there's another aspect of the show, not tell. But he doesn't say, Beaver arrived. Everybody was really frightened of Beaver because he was a really nasty man who did nasty things. He doesn't actually tell us anything that he does. We're left to infer it from those descriptions and the physicality of the descriptions. The black boots, the black trousers, the fact that the boy keeps his eyes on the ground, he doesn't want to be noticed while he's there. So that's just another example of that power of the noun phrase for showing, not telling. We're going to move on and look at concrete detail, and I was going to look at strong visual images as well. But one thing I wanted to say is that so you've got show, not tell, use specific concrete detail and visual images. Well, actually, both the concrete detail and the visual images are also part of the show, not tell, but not always, which is why they're worth looking at separately. Now, this is from Nicola Davis, the children's author that I mentioned at the beginning, who talked about the craft of writing. And she writes a story about an Italian boy in a Welsh village, a Welsh mining village, and it's a story of displacement and identity and how a child feels completely out of place in the place he's living in, with a kind of heart that's longing for home. And the story really is all about how he finds his identity and becomes part of the community. And strangely, it's a pigeon that does it. It's a lovely, lovely story. But what I'm really getting at here is this description of the pigeon, where, if you imagine saying describe a pigeon, I wonder what you might have described. But these concrete details about that heart, that feeling the heart racing underneath your finger, that feeling of the way the wings move when you're holding a bird and it's trying to, when it's trying to fly, but you've got your hand round it and it can't. That description of its head being whiter than a splash of milk. And so you've got the real concrete detail that help us to really understand about the pigeon and what it's like. And again, here it's the noun phrases that are providing that concrete detail. And if we move on and look at the same book we were just looking at, there's the bone sparrow, the same thing happens here. Concrete detail is used. And again, it's not to show, not tell. This is a description of a girl who's not in the camp, who comes and builds a really positive relationship with the boy Subi, who's the main character, who's in the camp. And this is his first meeting with her. And if you just look at that and look at the detail, the interesting thing about this is it's not so much telling you about the girl, but telling you about the boy's experience of being in the refugee camp through the details it chooses to give you. So if, for example, you look here at the concrete details, that she's a girl, but that physical description of her hair, but that she's got shoes, a backpack, she's holding a book, a real book, all of which are things that Subi doesn't have as a character in the camp. So they're not very exciting things, but they are things that he does not have. And it's the concrete detail that draws attention to his absence of having those things. So I want you to go back and reread that free writing you've got about a character. And I don't want you to write anything for a moment. I want you, first of all, to do a little bit of visualization. What does your character look like? So really imagine them. Look at the face. What colour eyes, what kind of hair, what colour hair, what style of hair, what skin tone, nose shape, everything like that. How tall, how small, how thin, how wide. What are they wearing? What kind of clothes are they wearing? How are they standing? How are they feeling at this moment when you're thinking about that character? So really get the details into your head. And now what I want you to do is I want you to actually write a first draft, just one paragraph. We've done quite a lot of looking at one paragraph. One paragraph where you'll describe this character. But this is going to be your reader's first encounter with that character. Just as you had that first encounter with the character of Skellig and the first encounter with Beaver and the first encounter there with the girl in the story, what impressions do you want your reader to have of your character on this first meeting? So what do you want them to see or think or feel or believe or know? And sometimes, of course, you want to withhold information. So, it might be that you've got Mr. Brown, a doctor. Do you want them to know he's a doctor at this stage, or do you not want them to know? So, and think about that, what we've been talking about, that notion of inference and the specific concrete details. How can you, in that paragraph, use descriptions and details that will create that sense of inference, but it will also create that sense of concrete detail that makes this character unique to you and not a generic man or generic girl that anyone could have had. Okay, just 2 minutes. So it's speedy writing, but I know how literate you all are. So I want to go through the next set of slides fairly fast, because I've got them on there as examples for you to return to later, because I want to make sure I get one final activity in before we finish. So the strong visual images is the same sort of point I've been making all along about this characterization. One of the things that good writers do is they enable readers to be able to visualize their characters. And this, I'm sure everybody knows from the Gruffalo, is just an example of how even with books for very small children, you get that detail that allows you to visualize. And, you know, you could ask children, if you're going to paint this, what sorts of things would you be putting into your picture? This is from another one of the books, the Australian books. This is by a Melbourne author. Does My Head Look Big in This? And it's all about a Muslim teenager choosing to wear a hijab as a positive choice. So it cuts across the idea of the hijab being all about repression and acknowledges the role it has in somebody's own religious identity. So it's a really good book. But look at the detail here. It's written from a teenager's perspective, but you're actually thinking about, well, instead of saying there's this guy in my class that I really fancy because he's really cool, the detail in it really does portray some of the things about Adam in particular, in terms of what how you might visualize him as opposed to any other bloke who's a teenager in the class. And I particularly like the dot-to-dot acne and the monobrow dilemma. But it's those little visual images that just help you to think about how you build that up. And then the other thing I was going to look at is this idea that you reveal the character's inner reflections. What does the character think about what's happening to them? And this is the same girl in that Does My Head Look Big in This, reflecting on what she feels like the day before she goes into school wearing her hijab at school for the first time, and you get that inner world. And just in case you think this is only about books for older children, it happens in young children's books too. So I think this is a book that would be familiar to most of you. When Grandma Poss can't remember how to make Hush visible again, she very kindly says, "Don't worry, Grandma, I don't mind." But then you get that reflection. The reflection comes from the author here, or the narrator, but in her heart of hearts she did. So we get that inner world portrayed through the characterization. And then touching in on that characterization and naming and the ways in which names can position readers to think about the characters in certain ways. And obviously it can happen in an extremely overt way, which is what Roald Dahl and Dickens both did. But, you know, Miss Trunchbull, Miss Honey, as two teachers, there's little doubt about which one's nice and which one's not. But, you know, J.K. Rowling does it in a slightly more subtle way, and a lot of it is to do with sound. You know, can you really think a character called Dudley Dursley is nice? And then you've got Snape, and perhaps the echo of snake, and the S being a sound, and Filch, and then Albus Dumbledore. You know, you're predicting from the naming what they're like. You could do a whole set of work on fairy tales where actually many fairy tales have no names at all. They're just the princess or the prince or the wicked stepmother. But when they are named, the female names in particular are rarely names that you'd ever get in your classrooms. They're made-up names. They're fairy tale names. Boys' names, you do get Jack and Tom and things like that. And then the names in that book, Bone Sparrow, Subi, Ma, Harry, Harvey and Beaver, actually reflects the different ethnic identities of the two groups of people who are working there. So I want to finish with the final writing task, where I want you to reread your draft paragraph. And I know you barely had a chance to write it, but just reread it and remember your authorial intention. Think about what you wanted to make your reader feel, and look particularly at your use of descriptive detail. Look at your noun phrases and prepositional phrases. Are there ways in which you can see that you've used the strategy of show, not tell? Have you created strong visual images of your character? Are there concrete details that are unique to this character that makes them distinctive and different from other boys, men, women, girls, whatever? And then make one change, a language change or a grammatical change, which you think will improve your description and satisfy that authorial intention about how you wanted your reader to respond to this character. Now what I want you to do is explain to your partner the change you've made and why. And the "and why" is the most important bit. Okay? So just to make that explanation. I wanted to make time for that last task, because that last task is the most important bit in terms of learning. It's ever so easy to give children the task I gave you. Read it again, make one change that improves it. As a teacher, you wouldn't really be able to know what everybody'd done around the entire class, necessarily, but crucially, you don't know whether they have really thought through that change, and that verbalising and articulating the reasons behind the change is the key learning point of that activity. It's like taking it one beyond the task itself to the learning. It's also something that you need to practice, because doing that is not a familiar way of talking. I don't know if some of you were saying, well, I changed it because it sort of sounds better, or I just know it was right. That we've often got an intuitive sense of why it's improved, but how can you explain that? So that verbalising is really important. So I'm going to pull this all together, coming back to the slide that I had earlier on in the presentation about the way we're rethinking about writing. What I've tried to do in this tiny time frame was to model some of that explicit teaching about language choices and show you how you could make that explicit teaching about really understanding about the relationship between choice and the shaping of meaning. I've tried to model a way to disrupt the writing process. So at this point, I think you've had 5 mini writing activities, but you have not yet even started to do what you would be doing next, which would be to write a story. And yet you have planned, you've drafted, you've evaluated, and you've discussed. So I've disrupted it, all of which is totally possible within the context of a classroom. We've used authentic text as models all the way through, no invented text, because we're linking up that reading and the writing. And I've stressed that notion of authorial intention all the way through. What do you want to do? What was the writer trying to do? And if you want to see any further resources, because I've had so much more I could say, including some of the teaching units, they're on our website. So if you go to our website, they're all freely downloadable. You're free to look at them. I haven't even talked about our 4 pedagogical principles, so that can be homework. Go away and look for those. So I hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much.